Hello everyone, today we talk about late Roman military standards, which actually would require a bit of a longer video and probably we will expand on it at some point, because there were really many, and there is an aspect about the military insignia broadly meant, not just in the ancient world, but I would say especially, right? It is overlooked in terms of, how, present they were, even just, from of course from a visual point of view, but not just for their tactical function, but and this is the most overlooked aspect, naturally the spiritual, the moral, the religious meaning of the same, and how this was crucial for any military at the time. Like a bit for the Middle Ages, we have an idea. Yes, it was full of banners, sometimes even too many, as we see in certain representations. Surely a medieval battlefield would be some of the most colorful experiences you can ever imagine, but when we think about the Roman army, we often say, as if everything was kind of, yes, maybe colored, but maybe uniform, right? We have this idea that had to be all equal, all the same, all looking the same way, with the same equipment. It was never like that, right? It was always different and changing and colorful and much more differentiated. And unfortunately, we don't know that much. When we talk about Roman military standards, we look mostly at iconographic evidence. We know something from narrative sources that tell us about how they were, the standards were paraded, what their meaning was, and we can assume from that, of course, the importance of the same. So maybe that's where we have to expand with other videos, because today we just look fundamentally at the aquila and the vexilla, and we will surely make the same type of video for previous times. We've never done it. I think we made a video actually on the Roman aquila, a Roman eagle standard. That it was like a history of religion video, but that we interpret history largely from this military religious perspective, as far as especially the pre-industrial world, largely before the nation state, perspective is concerned, because these were people who were living in such a deep connection between thoughts and actions that we can't properly understand today, where we live in a very aseptic, detached world, and we live always less, we feel always less, right? In that world, the symbol literally contained a magical power. This was true for any people, and as we've seen countless times, we try to distinguish between, I don't know, the Greeks, the Celts, etc., but religiously wise, but in terms of history of religions, it doesn't make the slightest sense by any stretch of the imagination. It is to say, these peoples basically had all the same cosmic worldview. That is, that could differ in terms of cultural shades of how they had developed the narrative, right? But as far as the broader religious meaning, the greater deity of the sky, that was the one of war, not even just Indo-European people, basically all people of the time, except but even what we call monotheism actually was fundamentally built upon the same concept. In fact, not surprisingly, if you look at the monotheism today, we will address the switch back and forth from, let's say, pagan and Christian symbolism during the 4th century, since Constantine or with Julian, etc. But the actual meanings, symbologies, etc., were fundamentally the same. There was a great god of the skies that delivered military glory on the base of individual virtue of mortals, and this glory was not of the mortal, was just basically being vehiculated through him. And this is the concept that stands, for example, between the concept of the Imago Imperatoris, that today we don't quite look at, because it was this fundamentally, this figure of the emperor was carried together with the army, because the emperor was literally, in fact, the Imperium holder. What does that mean? Is that a kind of rationalized, modernized idea of Imperium as a simply political faculty of bureaucratic nature? No, the Imperium was literally what dominated the world, and that was recognized with different names, but actually with the same meaning by all these peoples. That is to say, universally wise, There was no people that believed that, I don't know, at the acme of its power, the Roman Empire didn't actually hold the God's ecumenic power that ball, right? So whoever won in any context felt, could by, straight away declare that they had been provided with that because of their virtue by the military glory of the sky. And it was all the morals, the entire moral systems of these populations basically revolved around this. And we could expand on this. Hopefully, we will do it more clearly, especially from a history of religion point of view. But that's like the first thing that you have to fix, to sculpt in your brain, if you even want to pretend to imagine to study ancient history or medieval history, because if you don't know this, it's like it's not that history. It's just a joke, right? These people believed blindly that this was the reality of the universe, and there was no other possible mindset around that. Even in the Bible, in other religious systems, especially, we're talking here about Europe, the Mediterranean, were literally the same thing. They believed exclusively the single unique principle, and there was nothing else. So all the other deities were smaller things compared to it, right? And they just acted, for everybody when in there, according to how they were treated. We'll talk about this because the expansion of Rome was marked by also literally these religious practices. That is to say, the devotio also in the form of asking, in form of a threat, right? Of for example, the gods of a besieged city to make its inhabitants surrender, so that the Romans wouldn't threaten destroy their temples and literally wiping out the religion from the face of the earth, because they knew they had the greatest power from their side, and that therefore that could erase the one of the smaller deity. This was also another universal principle, and it was done constantly, even at the smaller level. What is another enormous mistake that is usually done is that people think that in paganism every deity was accepted and nobody thought of destroying other people's beliefs or saint. Absolutely wrong, right? Basically all tribal disputes were also about winning over or either destroying other people's deities fundamentally. It's difficult maybe to get acquainted with these ideas if nobody had ever heard about them, but this is just to stress that this world was completely homogeneous, that any distinction that you want to try to make, between the Roman religion or the Vedic religion, the Germanic religion, at the end of the day, it's declined in different ways, but it doesn't make sense. It's exactly the same thing, right? There are the same exact values, and that were shared also by these people simply because they knew each other, by the way, and they truly believed that this power derived from it. And the insignia here, why I'm talking about this, because the insignia were the literally perceived as the holders, the containers of such powers, right? Why were the insignia sacred? The units swore an oath on this insignia. What it means here, when we talk about the aquila, right, is that if you lose that, you lose literally the Imperium per se. Why was such a shame, right, to lose the symbols? Because these symbols were essentially representing the bond that existed between gods and the humans that had to deserve what the gods had delivered them, right? So if you owned the Imperium, because there were legions that were literally sent by a ruler that was the imperator that owned the Imperium, you held that Imperium, right? It could be provided to the legati, to military commanders and so on. So they held a bit of that given by the emperor. If you lost that, it means that you, as a commander in the troops altogether, you were not worth of that. And if you're not worth of that, you're basically not worth of being a human being. Because this is the concept behind the whole thing, that if you lose, even what was the average international, basically the standard actual international realization here, that if you lost everything. That is why were there slaves of war, why, there was the right of the conqueror in every population to literally do whatever the heck they liked with the defeated. Exterminating, enslaving it, raping it, chopping it to pieces, torturing it, and they did it on a regular basis. because those people were devoid of what a standard freeman slash warrior had to, by default, universally respond to the deity for. The same goes, this was, I don't know, among the Persians, for example, the idea was that you couldn't even tell a lie, because if you say a lie, the winged glory of power, of military strength, will fly away from you, and you were done for as a human being. So that's exactly the concept that stands behind that. So the military insignia here means simply that, something even more than that, because when you entered an army, or this can even be a war band or whatever, in the moment in which you entered there and you swore an oath on these insignia, it meant that you had made a religious pact. That is, once you enter the Roman army, you're not a free you're not yourself anymore. You're literally destroyed as an individual and recreated as a military unit. And your sole objective and purpose in existence and ideal in life is to fight and die for the insignia, because the insignia are you, are the Imperium, are what you are bound to. That is to say, the Imperium cannot be held by a coward. And no coward can also fight under the insignia proper. So it's better to die than to lose these. And you are essentially identifying yourself into that. This is, also another thing. If you study ancient medieval history, that's the concept. And especially in the ancient world, this was much more deeply rooted. And because they were closer to the primitiveness that had made them stand from. That is, if you, once you enter into these military, into the military, you do not belong to yourself anymore. You belong to the deity. So there is no other way out of that, but through maintaining this oath. And without this, there couldn't be properly an idea of the empire itself, right? There couldn't be any political identity. There could be any military power. There couldn't be any community cohesion of any sort. This is what stuck these words together, because otherwise they wouldn't even have simply any other thing in common at the end of the day. And this is especially evident with the Roman Empire at the acme of its power, right? So this is the greatness in part of the empire that manages to provide this imperial honor to everybody who serves the empire itself, right? So that extending the citizenship, all this stuff. This happened in other ways also. I don't know, in tribal cultures, the slaves could be freed for the sake of fighting. So there was a test. It's always an initiatory rite, right? But these symbols are the holders of the Imperium itself, so much that, famously enough, when an emperor died and they made his funeral, all the military would basically gravitate around the pyre while the corpse was being burnt, and the soul was meant to be ascending to the skies next to the gods, because they had been so high to deserve to stand in front of them, to be worth of their love for the virtus, the virtue. We made a video on the Indo-European value of virtue and how this is universal literally in every single Indo-European people. The Romans called it virtus in a way they had already. There are also interesting etymological distinctions, because the Romans were already kind of more diversifying their because of the complexity of their world, certain meanings. But the idea is that the military, that had been awarded certain, during that emperor's reign, all their medals or their honors, etc., into the fire, so that the Imperium that lived within those awards would go back once again through the imperial soul. That is what had managed, had made the Imperium pass from the gods to the soldiers as a medium, would be returned back to the skies, because obviously everything that happens on Earth has, it's because of, in terms of military glory, it's because of the gods. Mortals do not hold that. They just receive it if they're worth enough, right? So this is the Cursio. Check that out in Roman history. It's very fascinating, very poetic. So speaking of the late empire, we have naturally a transition from chiefly pagan to Christian symbols, and that's also very blurred in the sense that there was no moment in which, from one day to another, they passed from a pagan symbol to a Christian symbol. Many Christian symbols were pagan themselves. Many were not even contrasting with the Christian worldview. And more and more. And we've made multiple videos on how Christianity was actually okay with military service, and that it's a myth to think otherwise by any historiographical standard. That is to say, nobody in any world academy, I think, anymore believes anything like, Christianity was opposed to war. We studied it on multiple occasions. They just wanted to do it in the name of the right God, not the previous pagan ones. But the thing towards the military was exactly the same, right, and would remain, and it had absolutely zero effect on the combat effectiveness of the Roman army. That's also another myth. If one thinks otherwise, simply has no idea what military history is about. And also, if anything, probably the Christian unity boosted further certain sense of allegiance and participation to the army and so on. And we simply know, leaving aside that the aquila as a symbol, for example, in the Roman legions remained up to the 7th century in use, so centuries and centuries after Christianization. But also we know that, the average Byzantine soldier by the 7th century, if you study their ethos, their military attitudes, what they thought they were reasoning like, basically, there are studies on this, basically shows that it doesn't matter how Christian they were, how they actually believed in that, and they fought under Christian standards and symbology and so on, their military ethos was completely, totally identical to pagan times. That is, all their obsessions with, the idea of spirits, of the idea of, entering an animal's skin and acquiring power, getting this from nature, etc., was completely in use still at the time. So basically, the military values didn't change by not even by a minimal part in this time. So speaking of the late empire, I would say the most the sources here are basically Ammianus and Vegetius mostly. As we will see, Ammianus quotes in different occasions the Aquila and the Vexilla. It's in his work. I think it's 25:1, 26-11, and this means that the traditional insignia, so the legionary eagle, and in particular, that had been the most important symbol, the symbol of Jupiter Tonans of Rome herself and the empire, etc., preserved at this point their function of guide and symbol of the legions, right, as by the foe. We have many coins that show pretty well the iconographic evidence for standards and so on. We could go on with similitudes like, the idea of the Sol Invictus, for example, was overlapping with broader Christian symbology at some point, but with ideas and thoughts, the same victory, for example. These are all symbols that remain for a while, and it doesn't matter whether, certain times, certain, for example, statues were crushed, like the ones in the Curia, etc., that still, those were contingental political moves. The symbology lived on for a long time. Also, Vegetius 12:13 states that still in his times the eagle was carried properly by an aquilifer, so the NCO that was deputed to literally carry the eagle proper. And the figure of the ensign bearer is witnessed in a even clearer way also by other late imperial sources, albeit the prevalent one becomes, at least by incidence, the one of the Draconarius, that is, the Draco insignia bearer. What the Draco was here. It was essentially, in fact, a dragon symbol, probably mutuated from the Sarmatians. That took even the name basically from the symbol as the Sauromatai, right? So the saurus, the lizards, the kind of reptiles. It was adopted by the Romans since probably the 12th century. It's possibly even before. The Draco spread among different peoples. The Sarmatians mostly made their headway towards the west in contact with the Romans in those centuries, but previous contacts existed already before. What was the symbol behind the Draco specifically? Well, aside from the frightening, structure of the Draco that we'll see in a while, etc., and its role in the field, this symbol represented. Think about the salamander. I mean, the idea of a reptile that is conceived in these steppes religions as a sort of connection between especially the chthonic forces from which the iron, the metals are produced, right, and therefore the forces of the underground that are eventually used by the warrior. That is more kind of a Uranic figure, at least through the horse. That is also a bit the connection between the skies and the earth, symbologically in these religions, that manages to make eventually the night rising to the heavens because of military glory, right? So the Sarmatians had a very advanced metallurgy. They had very good swords and a cult, literally, of them. They thought there was a spirit living within them, and the same for the armor, etc. So the reptiles were ferociously close to this, but there is, to connection with especially with the earth and the metals, and their military symbology. And it's quite likely that also the Draco might have been actually a Chinese mutation because of the celestial dragon in the Chinese religion and so on. And even in their symbol of power, as the Romans had the eagle, the Chinese had, at least in a different way, the dragon. And these peoples went back and forth throughout the Eurasian steppes, and they would be influenced by both. In fact, the steppes is also populated by eagles at the same time. And the symbologies later on, the Sarmatians, get crushed by the gods, etc. The gods are full of eagles. Their symbology. Basically, the eagle was a pretty standard symbol but even the hawk, the other predatory birds, you find them in ancient Egypt as well. You find them pretty much everywhere. They were a pretty standard symbol everywhere, and it's very, very overlooked. Right? It went on throughout the migration era. For example, all Slavic peoples basically had the eagle as a symbol. Right? Even those you can't actually track, like, the Serbians, where you see the Serbian eagle since the 12th century, and the biceps one at that point motivated by the Byzantines. Yes, but probably, those peoples had the eagle since ever, because all those peoples had them, and it was a universal symbol for literally everybody. It wasn't anything specific. It was a universal symbol of power, and all peoples had it. There is, from the steppes as well, even the Turks had it later on, but this is just to make you understand how these symbols were at the time of immediate understanding. And just today we are amazed because somebody explains that it was like that at the time, but it's kind of because we just forgot it, and religious historians actually do know it pretty well, like almost self-evident reality. So the Draco specifically consisted in the metallic figure of a dragon head posed at the top of the shaft, and to the posterior part of the head was fastened a long multicolored windsock that, when filled with air while running, emitted a very characteristic hiss. Right, this sensorial dimension of insignia, of these zoomorphic, sometimes also anthropomorphic symbols, is also what battlefields were like at the time. That is, these symbols emitted, for example, a sound. Why? Because it's just, a modern person would think, okay, because it's kind of annoying and pressuring mentally. Yes, it is, especially when you have a lot of these things running around and tormenting you with arrow fire and all this stuff, hit and run tactics and so on. But here it's really believed that the dragon is speaking. It's emitting its verse, and it's doing it because this is an animal that is sacred to the gods of war and is going to kill you, and like that. It's just like, think about the Celtic Carnix. It's literally the animal sacred to the deity that is emitting a sound that is the same deity speaking, by the way. Right, so this is not just a dry sound, it's really modulated, and we have literally no idea how these things actually were used, in the sense that the sounds that they could emit were at the time done in a way that would simulate that kind of multisensorial experience that we can replicate the instrument. We have zero information about what that multisensorial experience would be about, and we couldn't even understand on our own. But they were literally meant to replicate this natural world to which they attributed these magic powers that lived intrinsically within them. So, without saying, the Aquilifer or the Draconarius were also special troops, in the sense that these were, as NCOs, not common people, right? They had to have some quality, a proof that the Imperium had descended in part on them, right? So that they could be worth using this symbol, and so sharing part of their power. So they had to be naturally also warriors. In fact, these weren't simple standard bearers. They had to fight too, right? And especially they were in the front, so where they literally had to guide the unit, because the unit, as we've seen, is guided by the deity, is guided by the eagle, is guided by the dragon. It's not guided by these guys. These guys just are, once again, a medium of that. You follow the standard because you have sworn to defend it with your life, because your life is insignificant in front of the greater power of the universe that you embody, and that the polity for which you fight embodies, and therefore you are meant to die in the blink of an eye for this. And here we're not talking about, romantic stuff, like, a command that here was, the screwed up. Look at Varus, they would kill themselves, because there is no other way out. Otherwise your family is doomed, socially, politically speaking. You have to prove that you're worth the Imperium, otherwise you're nothing, right? Because without that cohesion, you couldn't have a society, you couldn't have a civilization, you couldn't have a political direction. It would be nothing. So everybody followed these ensigns. Doesn't matter whether you were a legion, if you were a Sarmatian horseman, if you were a Germanic warrior, you did the same exact thing, and everybody shared the same principles and symbols, right? So it's obvious that the presence of the Draconarius in the Roman army that didn't exist, it's not witnessed before the 2nd century AD, obviously refers also to the fact that the Romans were employing lots of now for people that came from different backgrounds, right? That had, think about, the Romans have conquered Dacia at this point. The Dacians were very well acquainted with this stuff. They were more into wolves than dragons, but across the Carpathians there's literally the steppes up to the Bering Strait, and that's where the war would be devastatingly impacted and they already used the Draco much before the Romans themselves. So they believed in that, because once again they would understand what that meaning that symbol meant, because of the power that also derived from this iron technology, metallurgy that the Sarmatians have, and they're so powerful, and so they have their own, that god from their own side. Let's take it as well by also taking their technological know-how and all this stuff. So this had always actually happened like that, and that's why these symbols were so homogeneous, because they were shared by everybody. Same goes for the eagle, right? So according to Vegetius, every legionary cohort had its own Draconarius. This is Vegetius 1213, if I'm not wrong. And this statement is plausibly referable to especially the 3rd century legion, that was surely subdivided into cohorts, similarly to the one of the previous centuries, and it suggests thus the existence, also during the early empire, of a cohortal insignia that probably, starting from the 2nd century AD, was constituted in fact by the Draco itself, and in consideration of the frequent use of legionary cohort as detachments, as we've seen also in other videos, the so-called vexillationes, it is possible that the Draco had soon substituted the vexillum, to which they made reference and for which they took the name. So that you split the legion into these subunits that have adopted already this different forms of symbol, and this was normal, right? Also in earlier Roman times, it wasn't just the eagle. The eagle, and so the unit would take literally the symbol by itself of the Draco is the most important one at that point, and since that was kind of the standard unit, you know that in Vegetsus times the legions were much smaller than before, even 1/10, and they at times would the organic varied, right? But this is particularly important because we often forget this, that even the Roman eagle per se was never like kind of in paganism the absolute symbology of the Imperium. There were others, or at least there were other smaller ones. The eagle was dominating in many ways. Was the bird that can look straight into the sun without getting blinded. Is the one that gets closer to the heavens, that brings the Imperium literally from the skies to earth, etc. So that's the main dominating thing. But the Roman eagle is standardized as legionary symbol only around Marian times. Before there were other symbols. There were bulls. There were all the various subunits probably had different symbols. So the fact that the Draco would be adopted by some, right? There was the horse. So all symbols that, in a way or another, were connected to those ideas of power. The boar, like the Gauls, the Capricorn. So these symbols that actually also embodied the legion itself. That is, the legion had the figure of such animals usually, even if it bore the eagle, but still, that was its identity, right? So it was something that went beyond. It had. Naturally, was connected also to the origins of the legion, their traditions. Every legion was a thing on its own. Some of them were stationed also hundreds of kilometers away from each other. Were literally and kept on that frontier for centuries without much action. So they would literally transform into something on its own. Right? Never think the Roman legions were actually standardized in the modern sense of the term. They were very different. There were many local variations, even in the decorations and such symbologies and so on. Right? And this, in late Roman times, when the army is reformed, but also, is becoming ever more territorial in a sense, from one side, and also more kind of ad hoc created on others. This customization, this diversification does increase, right? And also with the injection of lots of foreigners in the army from the outer world. Right, we have seen it. We made a video, for example, on the Summacari since Caracalla's times were regularly hired from beyond the frontiers. So those were all peoples, Germans, Iranians, etc. Speaking of the Draco, I mean the Sarmatians, the Indo-Iranians, and all this stuff would naturally take with them all these beliefs that were fine, as long as you accepted the religion of the army. That was also one pretty public and very codified one at this point, and ever more controlled, especially eventually when Christianity was introduced, and in a monotheistic sense, that of course reduced this diversity over time. But as we have seen, it also continued for long, actually, in the meanwhile, before it was ended. And in the small late Imperial Comitatensis legions that conceptually derived exactly from the aforementioned Vexillationes, there was probably only one Draconarius. And if the hypothesis proposed by some historians relatively to the subdivisibility of the legion into operationally autonomous halves was valid, we could instead suppose that next to a single legionary eagle, each legion had two dracones, one for each of the sub-units. And in any case, that of the Draconarius had to be a figure of elevated rank, because Ammianus 24:18 quotes a Draconarius of the Petulantes that, as such, had the right to wear a torquis, in Latin torque, as the distinctive rank symbol, or as a military decoration that could be conferred only to who could cover it. I mean, and consider the torque is part of this broader symbology, it's like the iron ring of the Danish folklore for the berserkers that derived from the ancient military cultures that believed that once you wore these rings, you were basically possessed by the deity. You couldn't you were literally not yourself anymore. So you were just a medium even in there of this most ferocious figures, deities of war, and that was used, as you know, very well by the Romans themselves, by the Parthians, by the Sarmatians, by the Celts, by the Germans. It was another universal symbol of distinction. It was initially the distinction of those who belonged to war bands, who went around the world exclusively fighting and being guided by the deity there as well. So this is exactly the same thing. I mean, the Draco and the Torque here are part of the same bond. That is to say, this guy is the top guy who has demonstrated who is possessed by the divinity, and that therefore is a saint in a sense, right? You know, even think about Christian sainthood at this point. Was deriving in part from the same concepts. We've seen it in the videos about the root of knighthood. It was part of this initiatory rites of this military brotherhoods and so on, which the Roman army was by any standard. So in the 4th and the 5th century, the Draco is regularly found next to the eagles as a symbol of the Roman armed force. Claudianus, Epithalamium 193, uses the terms bellatrices aquile, so the fighting eagles, the warrior eagles, and the sevi dracones, that means the ferocious, the cruel dragons, in order to express the concept of the military insignia. So these animals literally were embodied with the same insignia, while he describes more times the presence of dracones within the Roman army, such as in Rufinum 177 and 365, and of standards adorned with volucres aquile and picta colla draconum, which means the speedy, the quick eagles, and the dragons by the painted neck, because as you've seen, the windsock was all colored. This is quoted from De Tertio Consulatu Honori Augusti 140. It's very important to stress from a moral point of view that this symbology is, of course, as we've seen, paralleling a moral virtue, but moral virtue of the time is absolutely in favor of ferocity, of evil. Like, these populations believe, as we've seen rightfully, that the defeated is to be done literally whatever you want to do with them. And in front of these massacres of enemies, etc., even during Christian times, it was perfectly fine to say, okay, we are proud of that. We've not just killed them, but we have literally wiped them out. We have demonstrated how low we can use of them. I mean, Christian times still there were areas where in arenas, rebel barbarian chieftains were made devoured by beasts to show how powerful and savage and almighty the Roman imperial power was in the front of smaller power with weaker gods that had been crushed by the ecumenic one, right? So the eagle that devours its prey, the dragon that is ferocious, is evil. It's literally conferring an evil. This is very important. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen a Dacian Draco that is actually a wolf, and represented by the Romans and also in Dacian symbols. Look at their face. Look at their face. It's worse than a horror movie. These animals were idolized because they were ferocious, because they killed without any kind of remorse, and because they would have to massacre anybody who came in front of them. That was the moral standard we have here. Naturally, the Romans were a bit, more gentrified and secularized for those time standards. But I don't know if you look at even, look at Germanic art where they settled into Roman territory, etc. Look at what they actually represented in their worldview, in their mindset, in their religion, in their moral essence. That, the world basically tempested by universal snakes that devoured people and with limbs scattered everywhere. Like, this is literally what you find in their art. That's the psychological background from which these people came from. And we must never forget that these were exclusively military societies. There was nothing else beyond the value of exterminating your enemies and being the greatest around. It's a warrior principle. It's the idea that you are the one that stands out for it, right? It's just a different scale of which you manage to do that, right? The more you come from primitive tribal societies, the more it's an individualistic warrior ethos of the individual that fights for his own charisma. The larger the civilization, the advancement, the development, etc., the more it's the collective training and the intelligence in using armed forces on a large scale and, with an actual strategical culture and organization, and so on, and drill discipline that only a central state can impose, collectively speaking. So, but the core value is exactly the same, right? And as we've seen on our videos on early Christianity at this point, Christian soldiers were totally fine with killing. It was their duty. What they were not fine sometimes when the persecutions arrived to corner them in that sense was just sacrificing not to a pagan deity and not to the Christian one. But the military service and the ethos that stood behind it was normal. Like literally the whole world worked exclusively like that, and there was no other option, right? There were some kind of ascetical, if you want, pacifistic stance, but they were, part of those people in society were marginated and didn't quite have power. But that was their own extremism. But the idea that there would be a state that would crush the barbarians that are perturbators of the cosmic order was literally what every religion had. I mean, look, the Asian Devani in the Germanic mythology, it's the same idea that there must be a social order of some sort, and that whoever disturbs it is to be crushed, and it's right to crush it, right? These are the exclusive moral standards you have to read these words through, because otherwise I repeat it, it's not history. It's not history. So the image of a Draco posed over a purple-colored vexillum and erected on a shaft by particular characteristics often recurs as the same symbol of imperial power. That is to say, it was a set of standards that were literally held by the emperor, by the court, etc., that embodied the imperial power itself. In 357, Constantius II entered Rome, according to Ammianus 16:10-7, quote, surrounded by dracones, woven in purple and elevated on golden shafts with gems posed at its vertex, inflated by the wind that penetrated in their snares and hissed as if it was caught by anger, right? By fury, as the spires of its tail were extended in the air. Right. Here we find a Christian context in which there is, of course, a symbology, a military symbology, standing and based on the figure of the Draco. But it was more than that, because in these, also the broader transition between from paganism to Christianity, were still symbols, literally, of the churches, of the temples. Right, they were paraded in these occasions. That this was not an embellishment. Surely it was a spectacle, but it was believed literally that these symbols emanated power, sanctity, righteousness, and that the same fact that the emperor could be surrounded by them in this case was literally a declaration of political cohesion. That is to say, all these important institutions are, gathering to celebrate the emperor and to confer power to him. This was the ecumenic universal ideology. We have other symbology like this. For example, at the Battle of Strasbourg, we made a 3 hours video on, Julian, that went back and forth across the line, it was a very tormented clash, is recognizable by his standard, according to Ammianus 16:12-39, chirped on a shaft higher than the others, on which a dragon was represented. So it's fascinating how the Romans would, and Julian as also still not properly an old pagan, but as an enotheist, let's say, but still, in love with classical culture, would accept for Rome and for his command as an emperor the idea that was a dragon, that he should be recognized true, right? So naturally, there was a very, very open world, multiculturally speaking, regarding to symbology and their universal meaning. There is an inscription datable to the first years of the 5th century Ameling that mentions a cavalryman of a Scola Palatina, so we're talking about Imperial guards, that covered in his unit the rank of Magister Draconum, right? A title, that office that could coincide with the one of Magister Signorum, so of the Signia. So making an equation between the Dracones and the Signia. The Signia are the ensigns, properly in a generic sense, and the Draco at that point could be the prevalent one, so covering the same. And this office of Magister Signorum specifically is described by Prudentius in the Peristephanon 133. It's not clear actually what role the Magistri Draconum or the Magistri Signorum covered in the units of the late Imperial army. In Prudentius' story, the Magistri Signorum of two different units had to dissuade the respective Draconari from their explicit refusal to bear the Dracones to pass to the Christian cross, and this would make us suppose that the Magister Signorum had the task to manage the ensign bearers of his own unit. So he was still supervising them, because the Signia are in general, so there wouldn't be just Dracones, but still, as we've seen, this would be an important one, the most important symbol. So the reference to the Christian cross naturally allows to make us hint at the labarum, the vexillum bearing the chiro, that is the Christogram, mentioned often in the Christian sources from Constantinian times onwards. And considering the elevated symbolical meaning of the labarum, it's generally very difficult to desume if one source, while mentioning it in contraposition to the traditional vexilla, is referring to the effective physical presence of the object on that occasion, or in an ideal sense to the Christian devotion of an army, a specific army, and or of its own commander, which happened naturally. As you know, there was a long time of ambiguity even to these matters, and the Roman Empire was like not really a unitary system. Like there were all different countries there that were more or less managed in similar ways. There's no regular uniformity everywhere, and lots of usurpations, a lot of, even as we've seen, foreign troops, which backed often the same. So lots of different backgrounds in a world that was transitioning very gradually from paganism to, let's say, from polytheism to monotheism. Albeit polytheism is just a monotheistic term, it didn't exist at the time. And anyhow, no source actually seems to hint at the fact that the labarum was, let's say, a unit banner proper, right? It seems to have been a specific symbol that accompanied or was used to shout out something. And when it's mentioned, it seems to be invariably referred to an army, to a complexive army composed also of different legions, etc., rather than properly a unit symbol as such, right? So you have to think that throughout all these times, such visual dimension in those wars was fundamental. Like, just think, even in a world without printing press, with high levels of illiteracy, what it meant a symbol, visually speaking. Like the late empire, the increasing of autocracy, the consolidation of a monarchic trend means that there are ever bigger, more powerful, more impacting symbols that are posed in front of it. And there is so much about this. We made a video on the Notitia Dignitatum that explains also this, that there was also propagandistic value in, exposing the symbol of an army, of a legion. And because it was thought really of it to have its own meaning. That is, the people who served in that unit were somewhat permeated of it. They were sharing, they were assimilating on their own, and it's difficult to think for us, not much because of the thing in itself that naturally we can't fully understand from their perspective, but because we have been told that the Roman army is like a copy of a national state army where everybody is the same, or everything is uniform and standard. It was, and it had never and could never, because we're talking about pre-industrial society, be anything like that, right? It was surely very uniform, very standard for ancient standards, but it wasn't at all for our own. And the reason why it wasn't is that they had limits as pre-industrial societies, but also they compensated for those limits in part with such deeper identitary, let's say, values in the specificity of a particular army or particular corps, and what it meant. And this would be very important throughout all history, but especially in this moment where really the empire was adjusting, and therefore also matters were often taken in the hands of the various provincial armies, etc., and who needed kind of their own recognition in the idea they belonged to a certain reality rather than another. There were political interests relative to that. I don't know, think about the Gallic Empire, think about Tetricus, the idea that they weren't seceding from the empire. They weren't like the Palmyrene Empire that literally was a foreign power swallowing chunks of eastern provinces of the empire. It was literally the same Roman Empire that said, okay, but we want just to share better our revenues within our own boundary, and to be consistent with our own strategical interests that incidentally they overlap with the imperial ones, protecting the Rhine frontier, etc. But we want also to be recognized as such, and the empire was surely composed by these different identities that I forgot to tell it in that video. That was important. We were talking about the other day about the efficiency of the late Roman army that would, in a certain sense, pave the road to the establishments of the same Romano-Germanic kingdoms, in the measure in which the local elites at some point, couldn't stop at this migratory movement, and they began to integrate these people by making them understand there was also properly a local aristocracy, a local power, an idea that, I don't know, there were major chunks of the empire that kind of made sense on their own, like Gaul, like Italy, like Spain, like the Danubian frontier, etc., because they were kind of different worlds, right? And anyhow, and it would be so much to tell. I don't know whether we will ever come back on late Roman imperial standards, but hopefully so, and because there is really very much more than this to tell in detail. But for now, just maybe we introduce the main concepts that is important. So we stop here for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.